Senator for Texas.
Mr. President, today we join the stunned community of Sutherland Springs, Texas, a small town near San Antonio, in mourning the loss of too many innocent lives. One innocent life is too many. I listened to the impassioned comments of our colleague from New York, asking us to do something. But I actually think it's important that we understand exactly what did happen, and that once the fog of this terrible, tragic events lifts, after the law enforcement agencies can do the appropriate investigation, then I think it is appropriate for us to say, what could we do consistent with the Constitution and laws of the United States? What could we do to make something like this less likely? I wish I was optimistic that there was some magic wand we could wave and that we could prevent terrible tragedies like this, but in a free and open society, unfortunately, we don't have that magic wand. On the other hand, we have arrived at a consensus, I think, in this country that background checks, for example, are appropriate for people suffering from mental illness, people who've committed previous felonies. Those people are banned from possessing or purchasing firearms, and there is a consensus that they should be. There are some early reports, and again, the fog of this terrible tragedy is not yet lifted, and we need clarity in order to know what did and did not happen and where we might be able to act to make a difference. There's some indication by some news reports that this individual had committed domestic violence and had been convicted of that by a court-martial. That, too, would likely have been a disqualifying factor in his ability to possess or purchase firearms. So we need to know exactly what the facts are. And I appreciate the passion of our colleague from New York. We're all stunned by what happened. But I think being rational people, we ought to want to know exactly what the facts are before we decide what the best course of action might be. It may be that, like we saw a few years back when at Virginia Tech, an individual who had previously been adjudicated mentally ill, that determination, that judgment was not entered into the National Instant Background Check System run by the FBI. And because it wasn't, because of a failure of communication between the state and federal authorities, he was able to purchase a firearm when he was legally disqualified from being able to do so. So those are the sorts of things that I think we could work together on. I know, for example, after the terrible shooting in Las Vegas, I was shocked, like so many others were, that somebody could essentially bypass the prohibition against making a semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon by the use of the so-called bump stock. As somebody who enjoys the outdoors and is a hunter and enjoys recreational shooting, I can tell you that I know of no sportsman, no hunter who uses a bump stock. It seems to me that the sole purpose of this is to bypass the prohibition about turning semi-automatic weapons into automatic weapons, and that's something I hope the Senate Judiciary Committee will continue to look into, and to determine whether or not the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms ought to be extended the authority to regulate these so-called bump stocks. Back when President Obama was President of the United States, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms said they did not believe they had the authority. But several of us have written to them and asking them to clarify for us just where they think they do have authority and where they feel like they need additional authority, so we can work with them, hopefully to prevent terrible tragedies like that from occurring in the future. But yesterday we all received the news that a gunman opened fire on parishioners in the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, killing at least 26 people during the Sunday morning church service. I can't imagine a more vulnerable time. People sitting in the pews with their heads bowed and their eyes closed, and then being exposed to this madman unleashing death in that house of worship. The victims included young children and a pregnant woman, among others. All of them aged 18 to 72, all of them now gone, all 26. This small community and an entire nation must now bind its wounds as we mourn the dead and meet the face of evil with moral clarity and a newfound determination to stem the violence that continues to plague the United States of America. We saw in New York, somebody used a vehicle, a car, to mow down people and to kill people in an act of terrorism. We are vulnerable in so many ways because we are an open society. But unfortunately, these sorts of tragedies seem to come back to us time and time again, and we in Texas are not immune. We remember the knife attack at the University of Texas in Austin earlier this year. We remember the shooting of police officers in downtown Dallas last year. 5 police officers perished. And at Fort Hood in 2009. Each of these events have been shocking, inexplicable, and certainly reprehensible. But this tragedy may be the worst of all. That this event occurred in a house of worship makes it all the more grotesque and despicable. Hymns of praise were silenced, and those led to cries for help. The shooting in Sutherland Springs has been called the deadliest mass shooting in Texas history. But perhaps it's better understood by the words of one man whose mother and father were both killed yesterday. He was sitting on the curb outside the emergency room at Conley Memorial Medical Center in Floresville, a town nearby. Shaken to the core, he called the events of yesterday unimaginable. It is impossible to comprehend what it must have felt like to wake up this morning in Sutherland Springs, a small, tight-knit rural community roughly 35 miles southeast of San Antonio. So many neighbors lost, the sound of yesterday's gunfire and sirens still ringing in the air. One of the people who lost their life was Crystal Holcomb, who died with her unborn child and several relatives. Another was Annabelle Pomeroy, a shy 14-year-old girl whose uncle described her as an angel in the flesh. We know, thankfully, that 2 good Samaritans turned on and pursued the shooter and may have prevented this nightmare from lasting even longer. And we are grateful for the heroism and the quick, decisive action of these 2 men. We know that about 20 injured remain in hospitals, including a 5-year-old, Rylan Ward, who was shot multiple times. Yesterday, I spoke with Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Wilson County Sheriff Joe Tackett Jr. and offered not only my condolences, but my unequivocal and complete support. Sheriff Tackett said the bloody scene inside First Baptist was horrific, but that the response to the tragedy was instantaneous. First responders from the surrounding area, as well as state and federal officials, inundated Sutherland Springs with logistical resources and personnel, offering their love and compassion as well. A proud display of what I often see, which is an attitude that being a Texan doesn't describe just where you're from. It describes who your family is. So today, Mr. President, I join the sheriff as well as Governor Abbott, my friend Representative Henry Cuellar, in whose congressional district this tragedy occurred, my colleague in the Senate, Senator Cruz, and so many other Texans, in asking God for healing and for understanding. We know the investigation into exactly what happened and why is ongoing. And it's important that we allow this investigation to be completed so we can know exactly what happened and exactly what we might be able to do to prevent tragedies like this from occurring in the future. I hope that Texans who call Sutherland Springs and First Baptist Church home will soon have some answers. I send my thoughts and prayers to those who lost parents and children and friends and relatives in this outrageous and inhuman act. I hope each of us will pledge to be a light in the darkness, and to the families whose lives are forever changed by this atrocity, let us provide a strong shoulder of support. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.